Laura, thank you very much. Can I firstly start by thanking Maurice Riley for being here today, for allowing us all to be here today. It's nice to be back in human company again and at this institution. It's a remarkable event, a press club event, and I look forward to coming back each time. I want to say thank you very much to my ministerial colleagues and my parliamentary colleagues who are here today, and to, in particular, the Chief of the Defence Force, Angus Campbell. I think he's just ducked out to update the Prime Minister on the Solomons, to the Secretary of my department, Greg Moriarty, to the Chiefs of our Australian Defence Force services, ambassadors, friends, one and all. Thank you very much for being here today. Well, today, as you know, the Australian Defence Force personnel and Australian Federal Police officers have been deployed to the Solomon Islands, putting themselves in harm's way in the cause of helping a friend in the Indo-Pacific. And this year, 250 Australian Defence Force personnel risked their lives in the Kabul evacuation, bringing 4,168 people, predominantly women and children, to safety. Some 24,000 of our troops and 440 Defence Department staff helped underpin the government's successful response to the COVID pandemic under Operation COVID Assist. More than 522 personnel were deployed as classified operations abroad, protecting Australians from terrorism through Operation Augury, preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction through Operation AUKUS, and advancing our national interests in peace and security. Many thousands more have worked from here in Australia to support their efforts. And over the last 2 years, Australians have seen ADF personnel, including reservists, at work in their communities throughout the 2019-20 bushfire season and during the New South Wales floods earlier this year. As we approach Christmas, most of us will look forward to celebrations and time with our family and with our friends, but it's not always so for our defence personnel. Men and women of all services routinely spend long periods separated from their families whilst on deployment. It's hard for them and it's hard for their families. They endure sacrifice on deployments. Those deployments obviously take them to all parts of the world, responding to natural disasters there and at home. For some families, the sacrifice lasts much longer, for them and for their loved ones, for many, many years. And I acknowledge the start of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide today. Our obligation is to do everything within our power to improve the situation for those and their families who live with the scars of war and conflict far beyond their service. This Christmas, I encourage all Australians to stop and to think about those ADF families who are once again enduring sacrifices in their own units, in their own family units, for our nation. Ladies and gentlemen, the primary duty, of course, of any government is to protect its citizens. Without security, prosperity is impossible. And without sovereignty, you don't have a country. Australians understand this, and they respect governments which take tough but necessary decisions to deliver security and defend our national interests. Now, that is why the coalition government has been embarking on our path since we came to office. In 2013, we inherited a policy and humanitarian catastrophe. Labor's weak security policies had resulted in 50,000 people arriving, as we know, into our country on more than 800 boats, and tragically at least 1,200 men, women and children drowned at sea. Now, we made the difficult decision to put in place policies which regain control of our sovereignty by securing our borders and breaking the people smugglers' business model. It was something that many claimed could not be done. And we went on to establish the Home Affairs portfolio, bringing together Australia's key agencies, our security and law enforcement agencies. During my tenure, we cancelled more than 6,300 visas of dangerous non-citizen criminals. We removed from our society scores of criminals convicted of child sexual abuse, of domestic violence, of assault and armed robbery. Home Affairs and the ABF seized record amounts of illicit drugs, tobacco and firearms. And most importantly, from my perspective, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation helped to remove more than 230 children from harm in the last financial year alone. The government's strong stance on countering terrorism has also yielded success, with 21 imminent attacks being disrupted since 2014. More than 140 people have been charged as a result of 70 counter-terrorism operations in our country. Terrorism, however, has not been the only tool of those who seek to strike at the heart of our democracy. Our nation is weathering an onslaught, as we know, of espionage and foreign interference activities at levels greater than at any time since the height of the Cold War. We have been determined to expose and to expel those who seek to undermine our sovereignty and to meddle in our democratic institutions and our way of life. The Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme has shed sunlight on the activities of foreign principals, which were once conducted in the shadows. And the Espionage and Foreign Interference Act of 2018 has broadened, amended and introduced new offences to protect our society. The Government Security of Critical Infrastructure Act of 2018 introduced a register of owners and operators to protect our national assets in the electricity, in the water, the gas, the port sectors from espionage, sabotage and coercion. And this week, the government passed legislation to strengthen and expand the scope of those protections. The National Security Committee of Cabinet took the contentious but necessary decision to ban high-risk vendors from being involved in the rollout of Australia's 5G network. The state-based cyber threat posed to our essential services and infrastructure is very real. In June of last year, the Prime Minister warned of Australian organisations being targeted by a sophisticated state-based cyber actor. Now, this widespread cyber targeting, as you well know, remains ongoing. Over 300 organisations have been impacted, including government industry, political parties, education, health, essential service providers and operators of critical infrastructure. But the government's pushing back against those kind of threats by bolstering our nation's resilience to cyber attacks. We established the Australian Cyber Security Centre with the Australian Signals Directorate, which monitors threats 24/7, and it helps defend Australia in cyberspace. Only a few years ago, in 2018, the threat had expanded so significantly that ASD's remit was enhanced to include offensive cyber. It's since disrupted the activities of online extremists, curtailing their ability to spread hateful ideologies throughout the internet. The ASD has also disrupted state-based actors and organised criminals conducting cyber crime and espionage. Realistically, though, if we're being honest, we're a finger in the dike of a cyber tsunami that's just on the horizon. As a long-standing member of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, I've been privileged to be a part of our government's response, which has time and again responded and adapted to these threats, but to many more. We've cut a path through troubled and uncharted territories, always toward peace and security. As the regional environment deteriorates and as dark clouds form, this task has become more important than ever. Today, friends, we face the most significant change in our strategic environment since the Second World War. Once again, Australia finds herself in a region at the very epicentre of global strategic competition. A region witness to a military build-up of a scale and ambition that historically has rarely been associated with peaceful outcomes. And a region where tensions continue to rise in a manner exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The question we must ask ourselves, though, is how did this happen? By now, we're all familiar with the frequent claims of the Chinese government that it is committed to peace, cooperation and development. We're advised that it wants to uphold and ensure stability and prosperity in our region and the world. The Chinese government tells us that they will cooperate with other countries to maintain freedom of navigation and safety of maritime routes and address peacefully territorial disputes through dialogue and consultation. Win-win cooperation and progress are much used terms from the Chinese government's vernacular. And yet we bear witness to a significant disconnect between the words and the actions, between the rhetoric and the well-known reality. Along with peoples of the Indo-Pacific and the world, Australians have watched, and we've watched very closely, as the Chinese government has engaged in increasingly alarming activities. The occupation, the fabrication and the militarisation of disputed features to establish 20 outposts in the South China Sea alone. The rejection of The Hague's Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016 was a verdict on claims of historic rights, and it was presided over by many countries, including China itself. Sending increasing numbers of military jets into Taiwan's air defence identification zone is known to all of us. Using militia-crewed fishing vessels to intrude the Philippines' exclusive economic zone is something we've now come to expect. Imposing a national security law upon Hong Kong, doing away with the solemn international commitment of the one country, two systems framework. Now, escalating tensions on China's border with India and in the East China Sea with Japan cause us significant concern. And I recognise the Japanese ambassador here with us today. Inflicting tariffs and bans on Australian imports like barley and beef and coal and lamb, lobster, timber and wine, for political purposes, undermining collective faith in China's commitment to global free trade and investment. The fabrication of a propaganda image disgracefully depicting an Australian soldier murdering an Afghan child. The issuing of a dossier of 14 disputes with Australia, a list of grievances which imply that our nation should refrain from making sovereign decisions and acting in its self-interest. And its Ministry of State Security engaging in repeated cyber activities against foreign government and commercial institutions, which multiple nations, including Australia, publicly called out in July. Now, regrettably, China is using its increasing power in security, trade and economics, media and the internet to compel compliance at the cost of respect. As China is engaged in these worrying activities, it's also rapidly expanded the size and capability of its military. Today, China has the largest navy in the world, some 355 ships and submarines. Its naval battle force has more than tripled in size in the last 2 decades alone. And averaged over the last 4 years, China has built naval vessels to the equivalent tonnage of the entire Royal Australian Navy fleet every 18 months. By 2030, China's Navy is predicted to number some 460 vessels. China has 2 other fleets subordinated to its armed forces, a Coast Guard that has doubled from 60 to 130 1,000-tonne ships in around a decade, and a maritime militia that routinely has 300 vessels operating in the Spratly Islands on any given day. Now, the Coast Guard alone possesses capabilities and maintains an operational tempo on par with some Southeast Asian nation navies. China has amassed more than 2,000 ground-launched ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles with a range of up to 5,500 kilometres. Over the next decade, China's nuclear warhead stockpile, estimated to be in the 200s last year, is projected to reach between 700 and 1,000 warheads. Every major city in Australia, including Hobart, is within range of China's missiles. Now, Australians expect their governments to speak frankly about the challenges our nation faces, to not ring-fence them from difficult issues or insult their intelligence, as Paul Keating did from this very stage only a few weeks ago. Both the Prime Minister and I have spoken about how the times in which we live have echoes of the 1930s. The world would be foolish to repeat the mistakes of the 1930s. We live in times of high tension, but the region is not on an inevitable path to conflict. But only if all countries of goodwill ensure together we do our utmost to steer clear of the cliff face, were conflict to come about through misunderstanding, through miscalculation, or through hostility, it would be calamitous for us all. Now, Australia's position is very clear. Conflict must be avoided. And to echo the sentiments of former Prime Minister Menzies, we are for peace. We seek the deep, still waters of the universal peace. We are anxious to live at peace with our neighbours. And Australia has welcomed China's rise as a major economic power in the region. We want China to do well economically. We want to see the Chinese people continue to prosper. Just like the more than 650,000 Chinese-born migrants living here in our country, more than 1.2 million people of Chinese ancestry who call Australia home These are wonderful Australians who value hard work, family, the rule of law, and are some of our most successful migrant stories. We want a productive trading partnership with China, one that mutually benefits both our peoples. And we remain hopeful that the Chinese leadership has the foresight to choose this path, that it takes the road of diplomacy and negotiation consistent with international law. But the lack of transparency and its rapid military expansion, coupled with a pattern of coercive behaviour, is fuelling concerns in many countries across many oceans. How can the region be assured that China seeks reunification by peaceful means, or that there is a limit to the territorial ambitions? What kind of relationship does China truly seek with its neighbours, Australia included, when it backs aspirations of regional leadership with grey zone cyber effects and economic intimidation? Can there be truly mutually beneficial cooperation when the terms are dictated by one side? Now, Senator Wong would have you think that I shouldn't be asking any of these questions or shouldn't be calling out China's behaviour. But in my view, acquiescence or appeasement is a tactic that ends in a cul-de-sac of strategic misfortune or worse. Just look at how China has exploited prolonged efforts to agree a code of conduct in relation to the South China Sea, to expand its territorial occupation and militarisation of the region at a cost to the security of ASEAN and to the region. Now, I believe we should call out actions that are destabilising and contrary to the interests of Australia in our region. We do this because the Australian people expect it of their government. But we also do it because we must amplify voices silenced by coercion, yet which seek the same peace and stability as us. And because in speaking out, we provide space for others to also voice their concern. And whilst the current debate is about Taiwan, the analysis must be more honest. Yes, there would be a terrible price of action, but the analysis must also extend to the price of inaction. If Taiwan is taken, surely the Senkakus are next. Please don't rely on your imagination. The Chinese Communist Party could not be any clearer, not always with their words, but certainly with their actions. And the point I make is the regional order on which our prosperity and security is founded would change almost overnight. In the absence of a counter-pressure, the Chinese government becomes the sole security and economic partner for Indo-Pacific nations. Now, that is a perilous military and economic situation for our country, but for so many more. And does the Chinese government wish to occupy other countries? Well, not in my judgment, but they do see us as tributary states, and that surrender of sovereignty and abandonment of adherence to the international rule of law is what our country has fought for and against since federation. It's come at great human cost. And any repeat of the mistakes of the 1930s would again exact a great cost on our country and many more. It's why speaking up and being heard now is essential. We are successful if we adhere to what we know is right, and we do it with great friends. Any wise government knows you can't base national security policy on wishful thinking. It must be based on objective facts and an honest appraisal of the circumstances. In the face of aggressive behaviour and great uncertainty, nations will quite obviously and naturally seek to buttress their own defences and strategic alliances. AUKUS, the enhanced trilateral security relationship between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom, is one such initiative to strengthen our regional stability. The first major announcement under AUKUS, of course, was significant, Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. But there is so much more to AUKUS. First and foremost, it's a partnership based on deepening our three countries' cooperation on security and defence capabilities and our values. AUKUS will allow us to better share leading-edge military technologies and capabilities between our three countries. It will bring our researchers, our scientists, industry sectors and defence forces closer together. It will see us initially collaborate on cyber security, our capabilities, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, undersea capabilities, and much more. In the longer term, there are significant opportunities for even wider cooperation, and the partnership should come as no surprise. In 2020, in the Defence Strategic Update, the Australian government was very clear. Australia has a highly effective, deployable and integrated military force, but it is not adequately equipped to deter attacks against our country or its interests in a much tougher strategic environment. The Defence Strategic Update underlined this government's intent that Australia take greater responsibility for our own security, including with respect to deterrence. As the updated AUKUS agreement provides, our ADF and through other policies that we'll implement must be able to hold potential adversaries and their forces and infrastructure at risk from a greater distance. If we do that, we therefore influence their calculus of costs involved in threatening our country's interests. If these capabilities can deliver deterrent effects against a broader range of threats, including preventing increasingly coercive and grey zone statecraft activities from escalating into conventional conflict, and that is very important. The decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines with our US and UK allies supports this intent. It's therefore not a change of strategy announced by the Prime Minister last year, rather it's a change in the tools that we need to implement it. AUKUS is not a partnership which seeks to impose an agenda on other nations in the region, but rather clearly to all. It complements a broader network of partnerships like ASEAN, the Five Eyes, the Five Power Defence Arrangements, the Quad and other like-minded arrangements, which are committed to promoting sovereignty, security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. AUKUS is one part of a framework of decisions. The government has taken many more and we will into the future to strengthen Australia's defence posture. When this government came to power in 2013, defence spending was at its lowest level since 1938, at around 1.5% of GDP. We've lifted it to 2% and it will continue to climb from there. We've built 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, the most potent warships ever operated by our Navy and among the most capable in our region. In support of our 5th generation Air Force, 44 of a planned 72 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters have already taken to the skies. In February of 2014, we approved the purchase of 8 P-8A Poseidon maritime surveillance and response aircraft. And in February 2016, we approved an additional 4 of these highly capable planes. All 12 Poseidons are now in service with the RAF. The Rheinmetall Defence has been contracted to deliver and maintain 211 Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicles for the Army. The first was delivered in September of 2019, only 13 months after the contract was signed. And in May of this year, Rheinmetall completed its Block 1 delivery of 25 vehicles. The construction of our fleet of Arafura-class offshore patrol vessels in Adelaide and in Perth is progressing well. And in the cyber domain, individual units have been established for the Army, Navy and Air Force, as well as one for the Joint Force. The government's investment of $15 billion into cyber and information capabilities is helping to protect deployed ADF personnel and their platforms, improve Defence's network resilience and make security upgrades. We're investing billions of dollars into maintaining, upgrading and building new barracks, training areas, ports, wharves, air bases and other defence infrastructure right across the country. Right now, Defence is responsible for 175 major and minor projects to an approved value of $121 billion. Tellingly, the most strategically significant projects, which fall under Acquisition Category 1, or ACAT 1, has increased in number from 11 to 21 over the last 10 years. The defence capability and the intentions were outlined in the Defence White Paper, Defence Strategic Update and the Force Structure Plan, and they are unquestionably ambitious. They're ambitious because that's what is necessitated by our strategic circumstances, because we must ensure that our men and women in uniform have the cutting-edge defence capabilities that they need to defend our nation and our interests. And that's why we're accelerating several of the defence plans, including through AUKUS, especially the development of the asymmetric capabilities, as I mentioned earlier. We're pushing ahead with the $1 billion National Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise, long-range strike capabilities, precision weapons and hypersonic missiles are transforming the nature of warfare as significantly as the first rifles or indeed the Maxim gun. The government is similarly prioritising integrated air and missile defence like the $2.7 billion Joint Air Battle Management System. Our investments are also contributing towards the creation of autonomous craft and remotely piloted drones. This month, 2 Loyal Wingmans, the unmanned aircraft being developed by the Royal Australian Air Force and Boeing Australia, successfully completed their flight missions. The key advantages to autonomous capabilities is that they can be produced in quantity and relatively quickly and inexpensively, and their loss or damage is also more tolerable. The strategic intent behind the Australian government's record investments is to drive new determination and speed into delivering defence capabilities. We seek to build a sovereign industrial base that grows our self-reliance and leverages our close technology and industrial collaboration with key allies and partners. Defence and defence industry can no longer be satisfied with a business-as-usual mindset. Instead, they must be driven by a mission of utmost national significance and urgency. Indeed, the government's investment in defence capability must engender faster delivery, greater competitiveness and new innovation. I want to acknowledge the work in particular of my ministerial colleague Melissa Price for her drive, enthusiasm and the way in which she, along with many of my other colleagues, including Andrew Hastie and our predecessors, have got us to the point where we are today, but there's a lot more to be done. We want foreign primes to bring Australian businesses more tightly and numerously into the fold, and we want to grow Australian primes. Defence investment supports over 100,000 jobs across the economy, and it's a significant part of the government's economic plan to rebuild from COVID, to integrate them as part of our defence supply chains, to share intellectual property, because the growth of Australia's defence industrial base, be it our sovereign capabilities, our capacity to contribute to high-value and high-tech defence projects, and our nurturing of skills, will complement rather than compete with the industrial bases of our allies and friends. And it will hasten rather than hinder the mutual defence capability objectives of like-minded countries. As the government proceeds with its defence capability plans, we will expect more rigorous accountability from defence industry. We will have less tolerance for project lags, and if necessary, we will cut our losses and withdraw from underperforming contractors or partners. This firmer approach is commensurate with public expectations, a new sense of urgency stemming from the deteriorating situation in the Indo-Pacific and the consequent need to rapidly acquire defence capabilities. Now, as Minister for Defence, my attention has been on ensuring defence gets on with its core business. To sharpen that focus, we must remember that the ADF is first and foremost a military force, led by the Chief of the Defence Force, and many of the leaders here in the audience today. I recognise them in particular, and to others who are wearing uniform or have worn this nation's uniform. We greatly respect and admire the contribution that you've made to our country. But ours is a force that enables Australia to lift, I think, more than its weight in contributing to regional stability. But there's no point in mincing words, and I'm not widely known for doing that, but alone our Defence Force cannot compete head-on with the military force of a major power. That much is obvious. But it must mean that we complement our defence capabilities with strong relationships of substance, partnerships among like-minded countries which are focused on the great endeavour of maintaining peace in our region, not nationalistic opportunism. We've been doing this at the bilateral level with countries in our Pacific neighbourhood, in the Indo-Pacific region and further afield. And through arrangements like the Five Eyes, ASEAN, the Five Power Defence Arrangements and NATO. And noticeably, like-minded countries are coming together as part of a network of complementary partnerships. It's a constellation which is growing strong and more cohesive. Australia has a robust defence relationship with Indonesia, for example, and that was evident during my meeting with Defence Minister Prabowo in September. We've agreed to undertake new training initiatives and operational activities, including in cybersecurity cooperation. Japan and Australia, great friends, and we will soon formalise a reciprocal access agreement. It will pave the way for advanced defence cooperation and streamline processes for deploying forces into our respective territories. This will be the first such agreement Japan has made with an international partner since 1960. Australia and India are also tightening their defence ties. When speaking with Minister Singh in September, I extended an invitation to India to join future Talisman Sabre exercises, which its military officers observed this year. Australia will also augment its defence diplomatic representation in New Delhi to nurture greater information sharing and coordination on maritime security. There are many other countries in the region we're also cooperating with, and we want to make sure that they can all come together. Singapore, Malaysia, the Republic of Korea, to name a few, are great friends of our country. European interest and engagement in the Indo-Pacific has also stepped up compared to only a few years ago. Ultimately, regional stability requires, though, the United States to be completely engaged right here, to continue to protect the peace and prosperity it's engendered and from which we have all benefited since the end of the Second World War. And that is exactly what the United States is doing, and they should be commended for it. November this year, marked the 10th anniversary of the US Force Posture Initiatives in Australia, a great achievement. Over the past 10 years, we've seen the US rotational force in Darwin grow from 200 to more than 2,500 Marines. And we've seen US aircraft take to our skies for manoeuvres with the RAF. In September, Defence Secretary Austin and I agreed to build on these initiatives to improve our air, maritime, land and logistics cooperation through enhanced US presence and through new joint exercises. Every aircraft type in the US Defence Force will cycle through Australia at some point as a result of that agreement. And I'll have more to say on alliance cooperation in the coming months. Ladies and gentlemen, Australians expect their government to deliver on national security, because when the government delivers, Australians can get on with their lives. As our nation has encountered new threats, the government has taken all necessary steps to keep Australians safe and secure, breaking the business model of people smugglers, thwarting terrorism, removing criminals from our shores, countering child exploitation, obstructing organised crime, fending off cyber attacks, foiling foreign interference, and safeguarding our critical infrastructure. Now, as we contend with escalating tensions in our region, the government is doing everything necessary to make sure defence gets on with its core business, to deter coercion, to prevent conflict, to preserve peace, to prepare for whatever may be on or below the horizon. In a time of great uncertainty, Australians can be certain that the government, the Morrison government, will act to keep them safe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Minister. As you said, you're not one to mince words. You said
neither are you, though, Laura.
No. True. You said recently it would be inconceivable that we wouldn't support the US in an action if the US chose to take that action over Taiwan. Can you tell Australians how you think that would end? And who do you think would actually win in a conflict between the United States and China in the next couple of years?
Well, Laura, the point I seek to make in my speech is that we need to talk about the consequences of actions as well as not taking action. And so the consequence would be terrible, calamitous, as I point out, if there was to be conflict in our region. And there's no shirking from that, and nobody seeks to hide that. But equally, you need to think through what the next step is. Does an occupation or a reunification of Taiwan satisfy the Chinese government, or do they move into the Senkaku Islands, where at the moment they're bumping up against Japanese vessels and the militia, the 300 vessels in the East China Sea, the 20 points of presence within the South China Sea? Does it stop at Taiwan, or is there a rapidly changing new region order that countries would sign up to? And so, yes, I think it's appropriate for us to talk through all of these potential consequences, all with the underlying theme, as I pointed out in the remarks that you referenced, that we need peace and that we are striving for peace and that we are striving for deterrence. And if we do that, we give ourselves the best capability of avoiding both of those difficult outcomes, where there is action or inaction.
But is it responsible for Australia to be so forward-leaning in its rhetoric about this? We're now out there ahead of where even US and China are having conversations at the moment. And can you tell Australians that, since you didn't quite answer where you thought that conflict would end in the next little while, would Australia come under attack if we chose to attack China or to take part in an action by the United States?
Well, again, Laura, and with respect, I just think it's a simplistic analysis of the situation that we're talking about, and I've tried to lay out for you and for the Australian public the reality of what we're dealing with. In Lithuania, acknowledge the ambassador here today, in Lithuania overnight, there have been very difficult circumstances to deal with, threats against the Lithuanian government because of their acknowledgement of Taiwan. And if you could point just to one example, then fair enough. But we can point to examples around the world. And the Chinese government posture has changed significantly over recent years, and there's no sense us denying that. And with every ounce of capacity that I have within this portfolio, we will strive toward peace. But we will protect our country, as we've always done. There's been no threat or suggestion of threat to our country since the 1940s. And we are facing a very different Indo-Pacific now and into the future, and we should be honest about it. And we need to be honest about it with the Australian people, and I think that's in part what I've tried to lay out today.
Next question is from Mark Riley.
Mark Riley from the Seven Network. Minister, in that speech you said that acquiescence or appeasement would lead to strategic misfortune or worse, and you said that in reference to comments that have been made by Penny Wong, Labor's foreign spokeswoman, and by association Paul Keating. Is it your charge now that Labor are appeasers on China? And if so, how do you support that?
Well, I mean, if you look at Paul Keating, I mean, you can Paul Keating or Neville Keating or Paul Chamberlain. I mean, you can take your pick. I think they're all pretty appropriate monikers for Paul Keating. I can't for the life of me reference any of what Paul Keating is saying to fact in the year 2021. There's a great delight in thinking the US might be in decline in Keating's mind. There's delight about that, and that's always been part of his public disposition. But I think we need to look realistically, Mark, at the situation. The ramp up of their military assets, going from 355 vessels and boats and vessels over the next 9 years to 460. All of the grey zone activity, the cyber attacks, and all of that. If you can draw Paul Keating's conclusion and agree with that, as a result, I just can't. And I think it's time for Labor to step up. When Labor was last in government, they ripped money out of defence. They did it because they had a $16 billion hole in their border protection policies and because they spent money on pink bats and school halls and the rest of it, and they took money away from our capacity to acquire the assets that we need. They took money away from soldiers and from those within the Australian Defence Force and the department to plug other holes, and funding under Labor fell to its lowest level since 1938. And that's not me making it up, that's fact. I mean, that's what Labor did as opposed to what they said they would do when they were in opposition. See, I mean, I've been around this game for a little while now. I've seen Labor promise things in opposition, and then I see what they deliver in government, and sometimes they are complete polar opposites. And in defence, there's no greater example. So they can speak muted, in a muted way, or they can speak in a bullish way, in a hawkish way, but at the moment, I think you're better off to look at what they did when they were in government. That was to strip defence of money and the ability to acquire those assets. And if in part we've got problems at the moment of not being able to acquire particular assets, it's because they weren't ordered during that period of government. And there is a long lag and a lot to catch up, and we're in the process of catching up.
Well, somebody who isn't Labor recently wrote that it is irresponsible and counterproductive to explicitly canvass the possibilities of direct military conflict, and a sophisticated government can maximise the message of deterrence without explicitly, airily and irresponsibly talking about war. That was Greg Sheridan from The Australian. So it's not just the Labor Party discussing these things, Minister?
No, it's not. And I can, I mean, I don't have Brendan Nelson's phenomenal memory, but I can rattle off paragraph after paragraph of Greg Sheridan's praise of me. I'm too humble, of course, to do it today. But also the Australian Defence Force and the Australian government, the Morrison government, which balances the ABC for us, Laura. But I know you want me to come back to the point. I think, again, we need to have an honest conversation. I see what's happened in the South China Sea over the course of, you know, the last 20 years. And we find ourselves in a position today which cannot be reversed. And if we pretend that nothing is going to happen over the next 20 years and that China is just bluffing when the direct quotes that we've heard from President Xi down aren't going to be acted upon, I mean, you need to weigh all of that up. And I think the Australian public deserves an honest conversation. And they need to understand that the government and through it the Australian Defence Force is making sure that we have every capacity, every capability to defend our country, to be a useful neighbour, to stand up for those that have been silenced, and to work with our great partners, including the United States, the United Kingdom, China, Japan, India, South Korea, many others in the region. There is a great deal of concern here, not just here though, in Europe as well. The Germans have just sent a frigate out. NATO is concerned about the comments of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. So I just don't think there is any sense in this denialism. I think we're better to be honest about it and to deal with it.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News. Minister, earlier this week your government decided to prescribe Hezbollah as a terrorist organisation, the group in its entirety. What do you say to the concerns that are being raised in the community, in the Lebanese Shia community specifically, that this is alienating a much broader group and potentially leaving open an issue for people who are sending money home to family, that they could now be caught up and accused of terrorism?
Well, Anna, it's a good question, and the government obviously has gone through a long listing process. I think the number is now 26 organisations that have been listed. Acknowledge the presence of Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO and National Security here today. And the government acts on that advice. I mean, we don't make a unilateral decision to list a terrorist organisation. We weigh up all of the equities, and not just from ASIO, but from AUKUS, from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, obviously from the Department of Defence and all of our intelligence assets and equities. We look at what it means for our country, and ultimately, as I said before, our government's made decisions in the listing and the prescribing of some of those organisations, which has meant that we have stopped terrorist attacks in our own country, but not just here, in the United States and in the Middle East and elsewhere, through the collection of that intelligence, the dissemination of that intelligence in a responsible way. And that's the partner that we want to continue to do, to be. And the guidelines in terms of donating or remitting money, it's very clear. And if people have concerns, then they should get the proper advice in relation to it. But the legislation and the change that we've made in any of these prescribing decisions is based on the intelligence community advice to government. And that was the case in relation to this organisation and to another right-wing extremist, nutcase outfit that was listed as well. So we take that advice and we act on it. Thank you.
The next question is from Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett from the Financial Review and a director here at the Press Club. Mr Dutton, just going back to your comments about Taiwan and the inconceivable nature that Australia wouldn't join the US in defending Taiwan from attack. What would be the parameters for an Australian contribution to that? Would it be simply using Darwin as a staging post for US aircraft? Would it involve putting Australian ships in some sort of blockade? Would it involve Australian combat aircraft hitting targets, including on mainland China? Would it involve Australian combat boots on the ground in Taiwan repelling a Chinese invasion? What are the sort of limits or horizons for Australian contribution?
Well, Andrew, I mean, through my comments today, and as I said, hopefully by speaking and by us being heard, we want China on a path and a normalisation of the relationship that we had with them in the past as soon as possible. I mean, that's the objective. We want peace, not just for Australia, for the millions of people throughout Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific in particular, who have been lifted from poverty. I mean, the great Chinese story is that people have, in their diaspora community around the world, been educated, remitted money back, returned back with the desire and the drive to build a modern society. That's what we want of China. That's what we want for her people, and we want that to continue. And I think if you look at the actions against the words of the Chinese government, as I pointed out in my speech, it does cause you some concern. And if the Chinese government took a decision that they were going to go into Taiwan by 2049, as they've publicly stated, or to reunify, then the question that you're asking is really put to the Chinese government. I think that's important, because we don't have any of this discussion if we can maintain peace in our region. And the United States is a very significant partner to us. And as I said before, we are an island nation of 25 million people in the middle of nowhere, and we have to make sure that we act in the best interest, not just of our country, but our region. And any decision we would ever take would be in our country's best interests and in the best interests of our allies. And for us, we want to adhere to that principle, which we've done in decades and generations past. They are the underpinning values of our country, and blood has been spilt in that cause. And we will make sure that we continue to, I think, stand by those principles and those values that people have fought for. And I will never apologise for that. I think we have to recognise that with the absence of the United States from the region, there would be a very different and changed dynamic. If Taiwan was taken back, as Hong Kong has, as I said before, the Senkakus go next. And then you've got to ask yourself what the relationship is in countries elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. Will they sign up to a BRI? And the BRI would be of a military and trade relationship enhanced arrangement. And that would be to the military detriment long-term, perhaps short-term, perhaps medium-term, as much as it would to our economic equities. And that's why it's important to be very honest with the Australian public.
So you'd be expecting huge amounts of Australian blood and treasure to be committed in the defence of Taiwan because of the broader game, the broader strategic picture?
Well, I'll let you be the sensationalist journalist.
I know, but you're the minister, you're the one who sits around NSC.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
if I'm a parent with a child in the Defence Force today,
Yes.
are they going to Taiwan to fight and perhaps die?
Well, I've answered your question, but I'll answer that last part. I'll leave aside the silly comment. I'll answer the last part. The last part that I'd answer it like this. This government and successive governments have been in a very significant relationship with the United States and with our other partners, including the United Kingdom, over many wars, conflicts and peacetime since the federation of this country. And we have done that for many good reasons. I cited the 1930s before, and there are many men and women who, as parents, sent their children off to conflict in the near region and across Europe and many other parts of the world. And those soldiers and those veterans suffered and paid a great price. And I never want to see that repeated. I never want to see it repeated. We deployed some of our personnel to Kabul recently in precarious circumstances, and I felt that weight heavily, no question. I do with anybody that we've got deployed in the Solomon Islands at the moment, knowing the precarious position on the ground. So with everything I am about, I want to maintain peace, and I want to make sure that that peace prevails not just for us, but for our region. And you don't gain that peace from a position of weakness, which is what some in the Australian media might advocate through sensational comments. So what I would say to those parents is that we stand up for the values that their forebears have stood up for, and that we as a country will always stand up for, and will do it with the capacity and capability and might that's respected around the world, and that makes us a valuable partner with those great friends. And if we're a weak and unreliable, untrustworthy friend, then we won't expect the support of those countries, and in particular the United States, into the future. And I think that would be disastrous for not just this generation, but for generations of mums and dads and members of the ADF, and we should be very honest about that.
Thank you.
Minister, talking about actions and words of the Chinese, just to take up Andrew's question, you're talking a very tough game about this, but it's reasonable to ask, because you say you want to have a frank conversation with the Australian public, are you seeing physical presence in any conflict with China over Taiwan, or would it be just purely providing, for example, cyber support through intelligence gathering?
Well, again, Laura, I think you're 10 steps down the road. Okay, so what I said was,
taking us down
if China takes a path other than peace, it's catastrophic. I don't want to see it, and I'll do everything I can to deter it. And we will deter it from a position of strength, not weakness. That's a big difference between what an Albanese government would be and what the Morrison government is. We are arguing from a position of strength, and we're strengthening further. That's our position. And if the Chinese government decided that they weren't going to pursue peace, and the United States made a decision, then under the alliance, regardless of who's in government on that day, would have to make a decision in our country's best interests and in other equities that we would consider at the time, including the relationship with the US and other partners, whether we would enter into that conflict or that campaign or that blockade or whatever it might be. And none of that is contemplated or known. The reference I made was to the AUKUS Treaty, which has been just celebrated its 70th year. It's served as the underpinning of the peace and stability that we've had in our country for 70 years, and it will, I hope, for 700 years into the future. It is absolutely essential. And if Labor's suggesting that they would break the alliance with the United States or that they wouldn't consider standing by the United States, Mr Albanese should publicly state that. I don't know whether that's their policy or not, if you're suggesting that it is.
Andrew Green.
Minister, I'll stick on the topic of Taiwan. You've talked a lot about the military potential for conflict in the Taiwan Straits, but I want to take you to other areas of practical support. What has Australia considered doing further with the Republic of China in terms of cooperation, perhaps using your law enforcement background? Have you considered the comments of some of your colleagues that there should be more law enforcement cooperation with Taiwan, or other areas like admitting them into more international fora?
Well, look, I am in favour of a continuation of the existing arrangement, which I think serves the region well. And there can be enhanced diplomatic relationships, there can be a strengthening of the relationship, and country by country will make that decision, as we've seen with Lithuania and many others. And in the end, we will make a decision as to the level of engagement as it serves our national interest, and that will be the guiding light for us, as it has been already. I can't explain it any better than that. I want to see the continuing arrangement, the respect toward Taiwan, toward the Chinese government as it is, and I don't want to see a change in that order. I want us to have an enhanced relationship with China. I want it to come back without having to meet the 14 points, and I want us to normalise that relationship. I want them to respect the international rule of law. I want them to work with their near neighbours, to respect Thailand, to respect other countries in the region, including Japan. So there's, I think that's the focus that we have.
The next question is from Ben Packham.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for your speech. The government will soon make a decision on a $30 billion purchase of infantry fighting vehicles. What are those vehicles for? How could they possibly deter a great power adversary? And couldn't we spend that money on something that would?
Yeah, well, Ben, it's a good question, and it's worth discussing, because there is, some of this thought out there that you can, replace this capability or take that money, offering it up as a save and acquire something over in this space. I think we're seeing demonstrated in real time what's happening in the Solomon Islands that could happen in other countries near to us. There could be, heaven forbid, another 9/11 style attack on the United States or the United Kingdom or here in Australia, which could cause us to work with our partners in some other part of the world. I mean, we just don't know. The CDF's able to cite, a great historical example in relation to the Vietnam War, the lack of preparedness and the ability to deploy quickly. So we've seen the benefit of working with our defence industry partners to acquire the best capability, one that you refer to, that saved lives of those Australian service personnel, has done over the course of the last 20 years in Afghanistan. If we can do that, then we should, and we'll continue to. And I just don't see that if we want to acquire, long-range missiles or guided weapon systems or hypersonics to deal with the reality of a modern warfare, or indeed the money, the classified element of the AUKUS agreement, dealing with cyber and with quantum and the work that we do with the Americans in space and technology. I don't see, robbing Peter to pay Paul works. And, there may be some of that where we can realign our priorities, but the depth of skill that the chiefs have brought into the Australian Defence Force is recognised around the world, and I don't want to deplete or detract from that at the same time that we build further capability, particularly in relation to Navy. I've been very conscious of this, as Admiral Mead has done an outstanding job, and Admiral Noonan as well, in bringing together the discussions and the negotiations that are ongoing with the UK and the US on the nuclear-powered submarines. We have in that a huge effort, but I don't want it to distract from the business as usual of the ADF.
So you remain committed to that program?
Well, I mean, program by program, I'll make a decision or an announcement if we've got a change of heart. But no, I see it as a very significant program for us, one that's important, and I haven't seen any argument that would suggest we're going to walk away from that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sarah Eisen.
Sarah Eisen from the West Australian. Thanks for your speech, Minister. You came into the job in March, which was a pretty fractious time for Defence in the wake of the Brereton inquiry.
Yeah.
Obviously, morale has taken quite a hit and so on. What are you wanting to do in this space? Is there anything you want to put to bed next year? Anything we can expect regarding Brereton that you want to see? And if I may, you have said that you have ambitions still for leadership for the party. We don't know what's going to happen in the election, but can we expect, would you rule out a Peter Dutton opposition leader for the party?
Well, Sarah, what I'm reading in that, if I can read between the lines, is that you think I look much younger than I am, because I haven't been express about this, but when the Morrison government comes to an end and the Prime Minister retires in 2049, all I've suggested is that I, as a young man, would be available if the party saw fit. So ask me again around 2048 and we'll see how we go. So that's the part of your question. We went through a very significant phase that Brereton responded to, and we have made mistakes in the past, both in the course of our time in conflict, but since then as well, in our response to it. And I've been clear of my intent to the Secretary and the CDF and to the Australian public, and in particular to the regiment, about my expectations and what I want to see. I couldn't be more proud, and I know Brendan and my predecessors would make exactly the same comment, couldn't be more proud of the service of the SAS. They're involved in operations today that Australians have no idea about, but that are preventing significant disruptive attacks on our country. And they are absolutely valued by their partners. And as Home Affairs Minister, I set up the process of the Office of Special Investigator. I think Justice Weinberg was an excellent appointment, and the others that have been now appointed to that body under Minister Andrews will look properly at the evidence that's been provided to them, and there will be a going through of that evidence and according to law that applies equally, whether you wear a uniform or you don't. They will determine, along with the Director of Prosecutions, whether or not there is any action to be taken. And that is the appropriate course for us to adhere to. Adhering to the rule of law, it applies equally to all Australians. And at the same time, having learnt the lessons of Brereton and significant culture change that's taken place in the ADF over recent years, I'm not looking back. I'm looking forward. And when I came into this portfolio, that I had the back of the men and women of the Australian Defence Force, I meant it. I'm not going to hang people out to dry. They do tough work in exacting circumstances, something that none of us, the vast majority of us in this room, bar a few, would have no comprehension of. And the dire circumstances in which they operate need to be recognised, and for many that takes a very heavy toll. And we should never forget that. So lessons are learnt, but for the 99.9% of people who do the right thing in our country's name, every Australian should be proud of their actions now and into the future, because they, frankly, are the reason that we're able to sit here in peace and stability in our country. We take a lot for granted in this country.
Next question is from Anthony Galloway.
Thank you, Minister. There's been a lot of debate about where China sits domestically and how that informs their intentions. Some say their rise is inevitable and therefore the danger period might be kind of mid-century when they're at their peak. Others say their demographic indicators are not so good and that we could be facing a peaking power trap whereby it kind of lashes out because it's not going to quite reach where it wants to. I was wondering if you could just offer an assessment of where you think the danger period is.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, this is sort of influenced by some of the intelligence products, so I won't be specific in relation to your answer, obviously. But there can be two tracks of thought here, in part, and it's deserves a much longer conversation than just 30 seconds. But the build-up of capability here in Taiwan, in America, in Japan, elsewhere, either provides a deterrent or it provides an incentive to act. That's a statement of the obvious, and there are differing views on what that outcome looks like. From my perspective, I think it's prudent for us to prepare and to have that urgency that I spoke about in my speech, to acquire more capability, to work with industry partners, to condense timelines and process, still to drive value for money and to build up that sovereign capability. And I want to do that in the near term. I think it's prudent for us to do that because nobody with certainty can advise me what the risk period would be. But it's sometime between now and the end of the 2040s, the 100-year anniversary. And again, I don't ask you to rely on your imagination for that. That is the stated intent of the Chinese government, and we have to work according to that, and obviously the other work that we do with our partners to make that judgment.
Next question is from Kim Bergman.
Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. Thank you, Minister. Part of your speech referred to the massive build-up of the Chinese Navy. But when we look at how Australia is responding, the British-designed Hunter-class frigates are already 2 years late. The ships are so overweight that their hulls are having to be redesigned. All of the early promises about high levels of AIC seem to have vanished. Are you prepared to cancel that contract and award it to someone else, or is that reserved for the French?
Well, it's reserved for those partners that don't meet the requirements that we have. And so the decision will be made on any of these projects by what is in our country's best interest and what I think we believe that we need to acquire to protect and defend our mainland, to be a good partner, and most importantly, to support the work of the Australian Defence Force personnel. And I've looked very closely at the Type 26, and I was in a phone hookup last night, as I've done and will. I've been very clear about my tolerating blowouts, and I want that capability achieved as quickly as possible. And I think it's very clear in their minds what we want and that we're not going to tolerate slippage. At the same time, having looked very closely at the contract, to answer your question directly, I'm not minded to cancel that contract. Very different circumstances to what you raise in relation to the cancellation of the diesel-powered submarine, which wasn't going to meet the technological advances deployed by China into the 2030s and 2040s in particular. And wasn't going to put our people in harm's way and wasn't going to have a capability that wasn't giving us the best chance of the preservation of that peace and also a regional superiority, which frankly we have at the moment with the Collins-class submarines. And the only other thing I'd say is don't believe everything you read in paper, Kim, which you look old enough to know that already.
Well, finally, Minister, if I could just take you back to your comments about the scenario of China taking over Taiwan and what that would mean, that, would the Caucasus Islands be next? Would that also inevitably mean the defeat of the US, if psychologically, if no other way, and the threat of the retreat of the US back across the Pacific, leaving us and our other allies in the region alone?
Well, Laura, I know that. I mean, this is sort of the Keating posture, and it's dangerous because
no, it's a reasonable question to ask, Minister.
No, I'm not. I mean, this delight at the retreat of the United States, which is shared by some in different parts of the media and other parts who are equally uninformed, is intolerable, and it's not something that we're going to contemplate. If I'm being very frank with you. You said before that neither of us mince words. I watch you on 7:30 giving the government a hiding every night. I had the great joy during isolation to watch every night, which up until then I didn't normally do because I was on the road for the rest of the year. And my hair's had no chance of growing back over the course of that period, Laura. So tonight could be a break with tradition. I want to give you something positive to report. I want peace in our region. I want our region to grow and develop. I want our near neighbours in PNG, in Singapore, in Malaysia. I want the Indonesians to enjoy prosperity. I want millions more in China and around our region to grow from poverty through enhanced relationships, through trading relationships, the amazing people-to-people relationships we have with all of those countries. I don't want to see a retreat of the United States or the decline of the United States. I don't want to see the decline of the China government. I want to see them continue to grow economically. I don't want to see them revert back to where we were in years past. And I understand the history and I understand their desire. But for us, if we want peace and stability in our region, we need the United States to be strong. The United States is stronger by having good partners around her. And we are a good partner. The Japanese, wonderful partners. The United Kingdom, wonderful partners. Many others, Singaporeans, wonderful partners. Many others through the region that you can point to, wonderful partners. And if we stand together and we work together, both bilaterally and multilaterally, then we can make sure that there is a peace that prevails in our Indo-Pacific region. If we don't, if there is a retreat, if there is conflict that we all seek so desperately to avoid, then it will be a huge human cost. And it will be catastrophic, and we do want to avoid that at all cost. And that's why the presence and the enduring presence of the United States and many other partners is absolutely essential. And I hope that that can get a good run on the 7:30 report tonight. Thank you.